Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second day and our third event in our It's on Us Engaging Men virtual series. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you for this afternoon's event. I am so grateful to a dear friend of mine and It's on Us, Szabo, who has generously offered to join us to lead this afternoon session. Ross is a social innovator who pioneered the youth mental health movement. He's the wellness director and founding faculty member at Geffen Academy at UCLA. Ross is also an award-winning speaker, author, and the CEO of Human Power Project, a company that designs mental health curriculum. Ross joins us today having turned a diagnosis of bipolar disorder with anger control problems and psychotic features at age 16 into an opportunity to educate others. His natural ability to make mental health approachable for large groups of people has led to countless media appearances. He's spoken to more than 2 million people about the importance of mental health and provided a positive example to empower them to seek help. During his 8 years as the director of outreach for the National Mental Health Awareness Campaign, he created the first national youth mental health speakers bureau in the country that is now a part of Active Minds. He's trained over 50 mental health advocates who've spoken to millions of people. Ross is also the author of Behind Happy Faces, Taking Charge of Your Mental Health, a kid's book about anxiety, and a blogger for the Huffington Post. His tremendous efforts in the mental health field have led him to receiving the 2010 D.D. Hirsch Removing the Stigma Leadership Award, 2012 Changing Minds Award, and his advocacy work was entered into the congressional record by Congressman Patrick Kennedy. Human Power Project's first curriculum entitled Behind Happy Faces is currently being utilized by over 200,000 students. The curriculum received the 2016 Excellence in Education Award from the Association of Fraternity and Sorority Advisors. Ross, thank you so much for being here today. We're so excited to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I am excited to have a conversation about masculinity and mental health. I'm going to take a kind of different approach to engaging men in preventing sexual assault. And the approach I'm going to use today is really just trying to help young men be more comfortable with their emotions and their feelings, which in turn helps open them up to more difficult conversations about affirmative consent and things like that. You heard a long biography about my mental health work. I also am a founding faculty member of a school for students in grades 6 through 12, and healthy sexuality, healthy relationships is a huge focus of our curriculum. We designed a wellness class that teaches students about their mental health, much like they would learn about their physical health. So once a week, every grade from 6 through 12, students have a class where they learn about their mental health. And then we mix in these conversations about sexuality and relationships along the way. So in the 4 years that the school's been open, I've learned a ton about how to have engaging conversations about affirmative consent with young men. Full disclaimers from the start, I am a white hetero cis male. So I know that this perspective often it comes from that place. We do a lot of work at the school to include perspectives from all different groups, but the presentation today is I have to acknowledge that bias is coming from a white hetero cis male, and sometimes that can be a benefit because one of the hardest groups to reach with conversations about mental health and affirmative consent is the white hetero cis male or anyone in that category. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to talk to you a lot about mental health, some of the biggest issues that young men are facing. I'm going to share with my own personal story, which was mentioned in the intro with bipolar disorder and depression and substance abuse. And then I'm going to take the last part of the presentation to really focus on coping mechanisms and how mental health ties into conversations about consent. So I am going to share a PowerPoint. I will open that up now. Hold on one second. There we go. Okay. All right. So one of the biggest challenges that I have as a mental health advocate is as soon as I say the words mental health, a lot of people have different images that come to mind. And the images that come to mind most when I just say the words mental health are images like this. People think of celebrity breakdowns. They think of people looking angry, sad, lonely, scared. They think of mass shootings. They think of people who have problems. And the biggest challenge for all mental health advocates is that the actual definition of mental health is not a person who has a problem. The actual definition of mental health is how you address challenges in your life. So mental health isn't having stress or lack of sleep or diagnosis or something wrong with you. Mental health is how you address all of those things. Your mental health is as important as your physical health. When you want to work on your physical health, you know you have to exercise, eat right, know your family history, and take care of your body. When you want to work on your mental health, you have to think about how you communicate, what your relationships are like, what your coping skills are, and how you can build your mind. And what I have found very heavily throughout my advocacy experience is once we can start giving young people, but especially young men, a clear definition on what mental health is and comparing it to physical health, it makes the conversation a lot easier because it's a concrete, tangible thing. It's not looking at just behaviors and saying like, oh, those behaviors are good or bad. It's saying that mental health is health and how we address it is really important. And so throughout this presentation, you're going to hear me return to this definition, but also make a lot of comparisons between physical health and mental health. The thing that I think is most important to really keep in mind here is that young men today are leading in a lot of categories that aren't categories anyone would want to be leading in. Young men today have a higher rate of suicide, have a higher rate of substance use, have a higher rate of loneliness and isolation. Young men today are far more likely to be mass shooters. They're far more likely to live at home through their 20s and 30s than young women. And young men today are also finishing college at much lower rates than young women and finishing master's and doctoral degrees at much lower rates than young women. Now, I don't want you to hear that as saying like, this is a slight against women. It's not. I think that there have been a lot of programs and a huge emphasis that was needed to help support young women in a lot of ways that have been successful. And we need to continue those programs, and we need to continue to change misogyny and change sexism and change the system that is pulling young women down every single day. But because young males are now struggling in so many other ways, when it comes to preventing sexual assault, when it comes to addressing mental health, we also need to be aware of what is happening with our young men because it's affecting all of our society. The one statistic that I think is really relevant, and it's the whole reason I actually started speaking about mental health, is that roughly 60%, 60 to 70% of young men don't seek help for their mental health. Young women are more likely to seek help for mental health than young men. And so I always like to begin the presentation by asking why. I think we can use chat. I'm not sure. Probably, maybe. I forgot to ask. If we can use chat, or if we can open chat up. Okay, we can. Please share some reasons in chat why young men don't seek help or talk about their mental health. And I will wait for your answers. Pride, stigma, a lot of stigma. A lot of people sharing either private message or direct message that it's a sign of being weak. Culture, conceptions of masculinity, fear, shame, society, ego, masculinity, weakness, embarrassed, emotions that aren't seen as masculine. Okay, so a lot of similar answers here. I think all of those things are true. And I think it's really important to start a conversation about mental health with this question. I had access to some of the best mental health treatment in the country when I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and I wasn't compliant with that treatment because I felt stupid, embarrassed, ashamed, weak, scared. I thought I should just suck things up on my own. And I did think I should just be able to get through my problems without any help. I was not able to get actual help for my mental health until I dealt with all of the answers you just gave. So I really think the conversation has to start with a clear definition of what mental health is. And then it has to move forward to why don't we talk about these issues and breaking down those barriers? Because as we look at how to talk to men about their mental health, there are a couple tips that can help. In order to make mental health more comfortable, it's important to start slow. So like a lot of times I think we think like, okay, I want this person to talk about their mental health. So like they have to tell me everything, or they need to tell me what's going on. When I first started trying to talk about my emotions with mental health, I didn't even actually have words to describe my feelings. I grew up in a home where no one expressed emotion. I grew up in a family rife with extreme mental health disorders. And all of the male role models I had in my life didn't really talk about their feelings. My dad was an extremely loving, caring person, but he didn't talk about his emotions. So anytime you're trying to help someone begin that process, you have to start slow and build up. It does help to compare mental health to physical health. So like saying things like, if you had a broken leg, you would seek help. If you had diabetes, you might need insulin every day. Just making that strong comparison that a brain is a part of the body and it does affect us. Approaching young men by reinforcing you care about them. It's very rare in your life that you would ever approach anyone, let alone a young male, and be like, hey, I think you have some issues you need to talk about, and have them be like, you're right, I have so many issues. Please let me talk about them. Typically, young males are extremely defensive when you approach them. So anything you can do to lessen that defensiveness, to let them know you care about them, again, to compare mental health to physical health. And then it's also really important to pay attention to how young males view their identity. All of the answers you gave and why young men don't talk about their mental health have a lot to do with identity. It's a sign of weakness. It's a cultural thing. It's embarrassing. It's stereotypes. It's stigma. Providing examples to other young men, even like whether it's The Rock or like other huge, like powerful examples of masculine men who also share their emotions, can be really helpful as they view their identity. I do a ton of work with student athletes and their mental health. And luckily now there are so many professional athletes who have come out to talk about their mental health. And one thing I hear from a lot of young men is it has helped them feel more comfortable. It's important to be patient as anyone develops a vocabulary to talk about this, which we'll talk about on the next two slides. And I think one of the most important things is acknowledging the small wins. As someone who runs a school and talks to students every day about their mental health, I'm very clear with them that they don't have to have their mental health figured out right now. I know very few adults who have their mental health figured out. It's okay to have small wins when you're not as stressed, or when you learn a coping mechanism, or when you open up in a new way. All of those things are positive steps. I think sometimes our society thinks like, if you're here, you need to jump to here. But the reality is in our life, from here, we might get to like here and then fall back, or like here and fall back, or like slowly build up. But no one really goes from here to here when it comes to mental health. So celebrate those and acknowledge those small wins. What I want to do next is just briefly discuss vocabulary and why it's important with young males and mental health. One thing that we are clear about with physical health is that we have different categories for physical health challenges. Everyone knows the difference between a sprained ankle and a broken leg. They know the difference between having cancer or having a cold. You know the difference between a lot of physical health issues. We need to do the same thing for mental health. So as we look at mental health, it's important to break mental health challenges into different categories. Everyday challenges are things that everyone can experience on a daily basis. Environmental factors, the home you grew up in, the school you go to, the way you're raised, that affects your mental health. Significant events impact your mental health, their experiences with loss, change, or rejection. Then there's mental health disorders, and then there's developmental disabilities. It's important to have this separation because what currently happens in our society is someone experiences a little bit of stress and thinks it's the same thing as an anxiety disorder. Or someone goes through a breakup and thinks it's the same thing as having clinical depression. It's not. These are very different things. Someone with an anxiety disorder doesn't need to be told to calm down. What is the opposite of an anxiety disorder is being able to see reality. Somebody with clinical depression doesn't need to be happy. They need to be able to live their life again. When you have stress, and are nervous, you can be told to calm down, but not with an anxiety disorder. When we blur these lines and we make mental health one thing and we don't see the differences, it doesn't give us a vocabulary to actually talk about and address our mental health. The next thing we need to do is really change the way we frame mental health. So a lot of people, when they think of a mental health spectrum, they think of this. So on one side, they think of people who are sane or may not have mental health disorders. In the middle, it could be people with mild mental health disorders. And on this side, it could be people with severe mental health disorders. This spectrum sucks for two main reasons. Number one, you can have a severe mental health disorder like I do and be sane at the same time. So if you're in two places of the same spectrum at the same time, the spectrum is nonsensical. The more dangerous thing that this spectrum does is it promotes the idea that these people need help and these people are okay. If this was a physical health spectrum, the messaging you would have got since you were a kid was, you do not need to exercise until you get diabetes. You don't need to eat healthily until you get cancer. And we don't do that. With physical health, we're preventative, we're proactive, we're supportive. It's time to do the same thing with mental health. And if we're going to do that with mental health, we have to change the way we frame this spectrum from this to something more like this. So this spectrum focuses on balance. Balance is you being able to do the things that you typically do, not somebody else, you doing things you typically do. And there's a couple of places on this spectrum. Able to balance are people who don't have to think about their mental health much. They don't have a lot of stress. They don't have a lot of trauma. They don't have a lot of triggers. They kind of get to float through life without thinking about their mental health much. These are the people that I hate most in life, but they exist. So they get a place on the spectrum. I don't hate them. I'm just saying. Difficult to balance would be like, I know I have stress. I know I have trauma. I know I have triggers. I'm just not actively using anything to help my mental health. So that could be the days where you know you're stressed out, you know something's wrong, but you're just not actively doing anything about it. Using help to balance could be someone who is on medication and in therapy, but it could also just be someone who every single day of their life knows they need to listen to music. They need to go for a walk. They need to talk to a friend. They need to exercise. They need to do yoga. They need to do something to help balance their mental health. You do not need to have a mental health disorder to need help to balance your mental health, because the definition of mental health is how you address things in your life, not having a problem. You don't wait to get a physical health diagnosis to take care of your physical health. It has to be the same with mental health. Needing constant assistance to balance could be somebody who's in a treatment program, but it could also be someone who most of you have already seen. At some point in your life, someone went through something so severe that you decided you couldn't let that person be alone. So you slept on their couch, you cooked for them, you hung out with them, you spent time with them until you were sure that they could be alone again. And then not being able to balance or unable to balance could be someone who's suicidal, but it could also be someone who went through something so severe that no matter what they do, they can't balance their mental health. I'll give you a very strong example of this, and I'll give you a content warning. This is going to have to do with death. So if that is a sensitive issue for you, like, just be aware I'm going to talk about something severe. 2 weeks before this school that I helped create opened on UCLA's campus, I found out that my dad passed away suddenly. There was nothing diagnosable with my dad. He wasn't on medication. Nothing had been something that was on our radar. And it's to this day the most devastating thing that I've ever gone through. And I went from somebody who uses help to balance my mental health to not being able to balance my mental health in seconds. And the grief of losing my dad was so strong that I wasn't able to balance my mental health for the next really 4 or 5 months. And it didn't matter if somebody was around me constantly. And it didn't matter if I exercised, went to therapy, did all these other things. No matter what I tried, I couldn't balance my mental health. And I share that with you because this mental health spectrum is not a judgment. It's not something where like we're stereotyping or talking about people in a different way. This mental health spectrum is about real life. And we need to put using help in the middle of that spectrum because that's where it is for physical health. None of you ever see someone working out or exercising and think to yourself, what a freak, what a weirdo. They're not naturally thin and strong. They have to work at it. Most of you, when you see someone working out, you celebrate it and you think like, oh, maybe I could do something. We need to get to a place where it's the same for mental health. So we need to change this spectrum that is filled with judgment and stereotypes to this spectrum that normalizes the concept of using help to balance your mental health, no matter who you are. And so all of this is important, especially when we talk about young males, the vocabulary, the definitions, the comparisons, because the human brain doesn't fully mature until age 25. I have a picture up here of a really great brain that is functioning like a computer. We know that young women's brains fully mature between the ages of about 20 to 22. Young men's brains don't fully mature until 25 to like, I don't know, 40. It depends on the guy. And when we say the brain's fully maturing, all we mean is that the last part of the brain to fully develop is the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is important because it's in charge of emotional regulation, planning, decision-making, thought processes, right? So before age 25, in most young males, their brain doesn't look like this. It looks more like this. It's wiring itself. It's forming connections, it's forming habits, it's forming patterns. And for this reason alone, mental health is not something you do just when you have a problem. Mental health is not something you try just when something's wrong. Your mental health is something that you build, you foster, you wire, and you grow, just like your physical health. And another thing that's really important to point out about brain development in young males is that they are hardwired for risk-taking. They're hardwired to, before that prefrontal cortex is developed, to create kind of a dopamine release in their brain. And that dopamine release can come from a lot of different sources. It can come from abusing substances. It can come from fighting. It can come from risky decisions or destructive decisions. So one of the most important things, and this is actually a study from Iceland, is to channel that risk-taking opportunity into things that allow the dopamine release without the negative effect. So for young males who embrace risk, matching them with activities that can help them release that dopamine that aren't dangerous, martial arts, skateboarding, sports, rock climbing, stuff that gets them that kind of natural high without the negative effect. For young males who are more introverted and not high risk takers, it doesn't mean that they won't engage in destructive decisions. It means it'll just look different. So for them, it's important to encourage reading, dance, arts, activities that recognize their personality and allow them that access. Unfortunately, what's filled this gap to a large part is video games. And video games are wiring young males' brains. And they wire them to react to first-person shooter things or to stereotypes that are caught up in video games. You're never going to hear me say that like video games are causing these problems, but they're certainly reflecting the problems that exist. The other thing that is a huge dopamine release for young males is porn. And we know that porn is hardwiring young males' brains. And that has a whole host of issues, not just with how to treat women and how to respect women and how to treat other people, but also with their own neuroscience of what allows them to feel pleasure and what allows them to enjoy sex. So I think before I go into my personal story, it's really important to emphasize that men need a clear definition of mental health. They need a vocabulary for mental health. They need to feel comfortable in those conversations to lessen that defensiveness. But because a lot of young men do operate from a linear perspective, giving them linear tools can be beneficial, as opposed to talking about mental health as a concept and not having concrete things for them to work on. So what I'm going to do next is share with you my personal story. I have a really intense personal story with mental health issues. I have an intense personal story that I'm going to talk to you about from my parents' perspective, from the history of mental health disorders in my family, and from a lot of trauma that I experienced and my own experiences with bipolar disorder and suicide. So again, I just want to prepare you if this is an issue that is a trigger or something for you. Just be aware that I am going to talk about some pretty difficult topics. I have a pretty interesting beginning to my personal story. Obviously, I live in Los Angeles now. I work at UCLA, but I grew up in Pennsylvania. Growing up in Pennsylvania is not interesting. Sorry, Tracy. What is interesting is that I was actually born in Bethlehem and raised in Nazareth, Pennsylvania. If you're not familiar with my home state, we have a lot of interesting town names. The reality is, if you are pregnant and you live in Nazareth, there is no hospital for you to have your child. So if you're pregnant, you can go to Bethlehem and have your child, but then you have to go back to Nazareth. I share this part of my personal story with Google Maps because I used to not, and someone would always come up to me and rightly be like offended and be like, "Hey, I really liked your presentation, but like you're not mental health Jesus." And I never said that. I never hashtagged that. This is where I grew up. Pennsylvania has even more strange town names than Bethlehem and Nazareth. In Pennsylvania, you can drive through Intercourse and Middlesex and Virginville and Blue Ball. So, it's not just Bethlehem and Nazareth. And I share this with you because this is where my mental health issues started. And I would like to blame the people who named these towns because I feel like they could have done a better job. Any story with mental health starts with a photo of a family. This is an amazing early 1980s photo of my family. There's a lot happening in this family photo. One of the things that I love the most is like my parents had an actual conversation and they were like, "Hey, what do you want to do with this family photo? Like, what should we wear?" And they were like, "I know, we should wear matching track jumpsuits and turtlenecks." There's other things happening here that I think are really interesting. My oldest brother is not looking at the camera, the dog is. In this photo, I am the baby being held by my dad in yellow. I am the youngest of three boys. My oldest brother is 7 years older than me. My middle brother is 2.5 years older than me. But this family photo, much like any family photo, can't really tell you what these people's lives have been like. So like, as you look at this photo, you would never know that my dad was raised by a classic 1950s alcoholic, that my dad was never hugged once in his family, that he was never told he was loved, that he never had a birthday party, that he was not allowed to leave his yard or his house, and that he was often the victim of extreme physical violence, much like his brother, his sister, and his mom. As you look at this photo, you never know that my mom grew up in a home with a mother who had an anxiety disorder and two parents who definitely liked to drink. I don't know that they were ever called like alcoholics, but they definitely had an affinity for alcohol. We'll say that, right? So sometimes my mom came home to a house that was baking and music and cookies. Sometimes my mom came home to a really dark place, but the one unifying theme between both of their households was that you would never talk about emotions. You would never talk about feelings. So when these two people got together, they did what most people do when they have kids. They decided they wanted things to be different. So my dad, who was raised in a terribly abusive home, decided that he would tell his three boys that he loved us every day. And he would hug us every day. And I can't remember a sporting event, playing a sport from age 5 until I stopped playing sports, that my dad wasn't on the sideline. I can't remember a speaking event that was within like 300 miles of him that he wasn't in the audience for. My mom did everything she could to make sure that our childhood was the best it could be. And for all intents and purposes, my childhood was amazing. We had road trips, camping trips, scavenger hunts, like all kinds of celebrations. But my life changed significantly when I turned 11. So here's a great photo of me at age 11. My middle brother's here, my oldest brother's in the middle. What we're actually doing in this photo is dropping my oldest brother off at the University of Pennsylvania for his sophomore year of college. My oldest brother is really book smart. I want to stress books because outside of books, not a lot happens. Um, but he's really book smart. He's so book smart that he graduated high school when he was 16, and he went to the University of Pennsylvania to major in physics. He got through his freshman year, everything was great. This is us dropping him off in August for his sophomore year. We dropped him off in August. In October, about 2 months later, my dad got a call from the University of Pennsylvania hospital saying, your son has been determined to be a threat to himself and others. We have hospitalized him against his will. We need you to come down here immediately. What happened is my oldest brother has bipolar disorder. He was in an extreme manic high where he hadn't slept for about 5 days. He was walking around campus at night, singing loudly in stairwells, trying to teach classes. So Penn hospitalized him. But this really was just the start for me. I visited my oldest brother in November of that year in the psychiatric ward. 2 months later, my grandmother died. 10 months after that, my best friend was killed in a car accident. And 2 months after that, my grandfather died. So between the ages of 11 and 12, this little guy went through a lot of loss and change. I spent pretty much a year visiting my grandmother who was sick, my brother in a psychiatric ward, my grandfather who was sick, and going to 3 really big funerals. And at that time, no one ever came to me and was like, hey, this is how you cope. Around this age, and sometimes even before it, is when most young males learn how to regulate their own emotions. And the way that I learned to regulate my own emotions was to try and make people laugh. At 11 and 12, I didn't have a lot to offer philosophically about death, but I learned at a young age that I was good at making people laugh. So I went to the hospitals, the funerals, the other places, and did everything I could to make people laugh. But I never discussed or talked about my own emotions. I never talked about what I was going through. And then around age 12, I started drinking alcohol. Not every day, obviously, probably 3 or 4 times a month. I had no idea at 12 that when I first started drinking, I was lighting up a slot machine of addiction. Because as great as a job as my parents did, the one thing that they could never change is that on both sides of our family, we have bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety disorders, and a huge amount of addiction. So as I went through these very first experiences with trauma and loss, the coping mechanisms that I developed, the way I wired my brain is what stuck the most. There are things that can be done for young males that are this young. In a lot of kindergarten through grade 8 schools, they use social emotional learning, which is basically normalizing and helping young people to talk about their feelings. Mindfulness has a huge evidence-based data showing the effectiveness of helping young men regulate their emotions. One of the most famous approaches for social emotional learning is the ruler approach from Yale. A really amazing mindfulness program is called Mind Up from the Hahn Foundation. In this time period, it is extremely important to normalize emotion, to help people find a vocabulary, to help people express themselves in different ways. I didn't have those options. I didn't have that happen. And so what happened to me was for the next 4 years, really, I kept hiding my emotions and I kept drinking. And then by the time I turned 16, it's okay to laugh at this photo. Who thought this guy would have trouble adjusting to high school? Probably a lot of people. That's when I started having classic symptoms of bipolar disorder. And when I started having the classic symptoms of bipolar disorder, I didn't really know how to talk about it. So I just started binge drinking more until the point of passing out. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was 16, but 2 really dangerous things happened before that. Number 1, I had been hiding my emotions now for 4 to 5 years. And number 2, I learned to drink alcohol before I learned to talk about my feelings. So as I went through my junior year of high school and into my senior year, that's what I kept doing. I kept drinking and I kept shutting down. In my senior year of high school, I went into a really deep state of depression. It started off with me feeling lonely, felt like there was no one to talk to, no one would understand me. But even if there was someone to talk to, I thought I should suck it up. I should deal with it on my own. If I couldn't, I must be weak. There's a huge difference between feeling depressed and having clinical depression. When you feel depressed or upset or sad, those are things that have an identifiable cause. You go through something difficult, you might need to talk about it, but the opposite of feeling depressed is happiness. When you have depression, you don't have an identifiable cause. Everything sucks, everything hurts, and you don't know why. You stop taking care of yourself. You may have thoughts of death or suicide. The symptoms last for weeks or more. A very famous author, Andrew Solomon, says the opposite of having clinical depression is not happiness, it's vitality. In November of my senior year, I started having thoughts about death and suicide 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But again, I didn't talk about it. For 2 months of my senior year, anytime I was in front of people, I put on my happy face. I made everyone laugh, I made everyone smile. And then I went home and I either cried myself to sleep or I didn't sleep at all. I honestly believe like one day I'd wake up and I just want to live again. But unfortunately, that day never came. On January 5th of my senior year of high school, I was hospitalized for attempting to take my own life. And nothing happened that day. I went to school like I always did. Had a basketball game that night, played in the game, we won the game. I went to a restaurant with my friends to celebrate like we always did. And on the way home from that restaurant, I decided I no longer wanted to live. What's really scary about that is that I didn't want to die. And so people always ask me, like, why'd you try and kill yourself if you didn't want to die? I didn't want to die. I just couldn't handle living the way I was living anymore. Those thoughts of death and suicide ruminating through my brain, I didn't feel like there was another way out. So when I woke up in the hospital after attempting to take my own life, I was on suicide warning. I had no drawstrings in my sweatshirt, no shoelaces in my shoes, no sheets on my bed, someone watching me 24 hours a day. And a couple days after that, we had group therapy in the hospital and everyone had to stand up and talk about why they were there. And the stories before mine were filled with really traumatic things. And then they came to me and they were like, okay, why are you here? And I honestly didn't know what to say. I was 17. I never imagined I'd be in a psychiatric ward. And so they were like, okay, if you don't know why you're here, can you at least tell us about your life? And I was like, yeah, I can do that. My name's Ross. I'm president of my class. I played varsity basketball for 3 years. I'm a member of SAD and peer helper. I volunteered 5 years for the Special Olympics. I attended the National Youth Leadership Forum in Washington, D.C. I have a 3.6 GPA. And I stopped. And I felt really stupid because the life I was describing was my external life. It was the life that everyone else saw, but it wasn't the life that I lived. If I wanted to talk about the life that I lived, I should have stood up and said, hi, my name's Ross and I hate myself. I hate myself so much. I'm willing to binge drink and drive. And I don't care what happens to me. And I didn't say that. And I share this part of my story because it's not actually about me. It's about all of you. Because how many people do you know who have an external life that everybody sees and an internal life that's completely different? All of us do that. All of us put up fronts or defense mechanisms to make everyone think everything's okay. And young men have a mask that they wear almost every day. A mask that hides their vulnerability, a mask that hides their ability to talk about what's going on and what's happening. Eventually, I got out of this psychiatric ward and I went back to high school. When I went back to high school, all of a sudden everything was different. Before I went to this hospital, I was the cool guy. I was the guy everyone partied with and liked and knew. When I got out of the hospital, all of a sudden people just started calling me a psycho and a crazy kid. A psychologist came into one of my classrooms 2 months after I got out of the hospital to talk about patients he treated. And as he did, every single student in that classroom started laughing. But I wasn't laughing. At that point, I'd been laughed at too much. So I grabbed my teacher and I took him to the hallway and I said, hey, this isn't funny to me. And he looked down at me in a very rural Pennsylvania way and he said, okay, well, what do you want to do about it? And I said, let me speak. Let me tell people what it's like to go through this. I stood up in that exact same classroom 2 weeks later and I spoke about my experiences for the first time. And it did not go as smoothly as this. I sweated through my clothes. I shook violently. But when I finished my presentation, a lot of people opened up about their stories. And I learned at a young age that if you share your story, it opens other people to sharing their stories. My journey with mental health was not rosy after that. It was actually much worse. I graduated high school, went to American University in DC, had a major relapse, came home, went to a local college near my house for 3 semesters, took some time off. Eventually, I returned to American University 4 years after I started for my original freshman year. And when I went back, my external life and internal life divide was so huge, and so much worse than when I was 18. And that first semester back, one night, I drank so much that I passed out for about 22 hours. And that really was my rock bottom moment. It wasn't when I tried to kill myself. It was when I actively didn't care if I died. And so that moment at age 22 was when I first accepted that I had any problems. And then it has been a process with my mental health since then. I think the biggest lesson I learned in my recovery is that I never chose to have bipolar disorder. I never chose to go through trauma, but I could choose to change the way I cope with it. I could stop drinking. I could stop hiding my emotions. I could start finding ways to express myself, finding ways to reach out to others and really balance my life. Ultimately, I have been able to find different ways to cope with my mental health. But I think that the most important messages I can leave you with about young men are no young male in this country or any person in this country chooses to go through trauma or loss or a diagnosis, but we do have to focus on their coping mechanisms. And we do have to acknowledge that every single person in this country has a different way of coping every day. You cope with school, you cope with jobs, you cope with family, you cope with relationships, you cope with your future, your finances. As we look at the human brain, there are synapses, and synapses, when they send messages, create pathways in our brain. The longer a message is sent, the more automatic the behavior becomes. So if you look at the world's top athletes, these are people who've played a sport for so long, they do it unconsciously. They never think about it. When Serena Williams is on a court, she never thinks, here comes a yellow ball, I need to move my arm and hit it. She doesn't have time for that. Their brains are automatic. This is one of the most amazing things about the human brain. For all of you who play an instrument, who play video games, who play a sport, who drive a car, who do anything, like, our brain loves to learn new behaviors and make them automatic, but it has a downside. I started drinking alcohol when I was 12. I binge drank for pretty much every emotional trigger I had from age 16 until I was 22. The longer you use a coping mechanism, the more automatic it becomes. The deeper those pathways get, the harder it is to change them. So for young males who learn to cope by not talking, who learn to cope by isolating, who learn to cope by fighting, who learn to cope by zoning out, who learn to cope by doing any of those things, it's a really difficult change. And like I said earlier, you don't go from here to here. You move very slowly through that process. I think one of the most important things to pay attention to with young males is, when is their coping mechanism a release and when is it a reinforcement? Some people listen to an angry song, release their anger and feel better. Some people listen to angry music for weeks and then go out and fight people. Some people play video games as a coping mechanism to connect with their friends, to talk and release emotions. Some people isolate themselves and play video games to a point where it's no longer benefiting them. That release versus reinforcement piece is critical to coping. For young men who want to change their coping mechanisms, there are steps. You have to, one, want to do it. Two, you have to be able to identify the coping mechanism while you're doing it. You have to replace the ineffective coping mechanism with something effective, and then you have to practice it until you wire your brain enough that that coping mechanism works for you. One of the most important things that can help young men is having an environment that allows them to change and be patient. My process through mental health was not quick. It took me years to undo the self-hatred that I had. the disappointment, the anger, the angst, to be able to even address the actual underlying issues. But I had an environment of friends, of partners, of family members who never left me and let me mess up, because it's not a linear, quick process. And the last thing I want to talk about here is, how does mental health tie into sexual assault prevention? So there's a couple ways that are direct. One, normalizing conversations about mental health can normalize conversations about other issues like affirmative consent. When young males feel more comfortable with all the things I just addressed, their emotional regulation, their coping, all those other things, it can make conversations about affirmative consent more comfortable, because they know who they are. They know what they're hiding. They know what they might be acting out upon in cases of sexual assault. And so it opens that door to deeper conversations. A lot of young men fear being wrong. In my middle school classrooms, I have watched 7th grade boys stop full sentence with a panicked look in their eyes and start crying and look at me and say, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean what I was going to say, even though their sentence wasn't as terrible as they thought. Young boys are watching everything that's happening, and they're worried that if they share something, they're going to be canceled. Canceled in their 7th grade class, canceled by their friends, canceled in a lot of ways that aren't healthy. I am not saying that we should ever make derogatory, sexist, misogynistic comments okay. But I have seen firsthand that especially some of our youngest males need room to see where they can grow, or to see a different perspective of how they can better themselves. They can't do that at the expense or by harming other people. But young men really are scared that if they say or do something wrong, they'll be canceled. So they're hiding their actual messed up emotions about this and then acting them out in different ways. At our school, we do a lot to teach young men to talk to each other about their emotions and affirmative consent. So in our actual school, we have conversations with young men about how they can talk to their friends about consent. What does that look like? When a young male is talking about how he hooked up with another person, whether it's male, female, non-binary, the other young males can ask, like, oh yeah, like, how did you get consent for that? How did you, what did you do? Like, were they okay with that? And having them practice that, so that option is normalized from a younger age. As people get older, that stuff gets really difficult. So we're trying to do that at a young age. And then really trying to help young males deepen their friendships beyond activities they do together. Most of my friends when I was younger were just friends I drank with or friends I played sports with, but we didn't actually have a connection. So trying to really focus on how that can grow and build. The last thing I want to talk about is throughout this presentation, I focused on neuroplasticity and the brain being able to change itself. I want to tell you one more part of my personal story that I think is relevant to all of us. When I turned 21, my parents took me out for a birthday dinner, pretty standard birthday dinner. We went to a restaurant, we ordered appetizers, server walked away, and then both of my parents started crying, which was not standard. My mom rarely cries. I had not seen my dad cry really much in my life at all. So I got really confused. And I looked at my parents and I was like, hey, like, why are you guys crying? And my dad looked back at me through those kind of like choked up, bawling breaths. And he said, we didn't think that you would live to be 21. I gave my parents a lot of reasons to not think I would live to be 21, but I did. I can't tell you how many hands I've held, how many people I've hugged, how many tears I've seen from people all over this country who had a friend or family member who didn't make it to be 21. I lost a cousin to an opiate addiction when he was 24. My point is, all of us on this Zoom call today, we only have one life, and this is it. And most of us spend our days going through a checklist of things we have to do. And then once that checklist is done, we all go to our own places of comfort our own places of peace. For some of you, that could be your room. For some of you, it could be a person, could be a song, could be a phone. My ask is the next time that you're in your place of comfort, you're in your place of peace, you think about your internal life and how you can express it more. Because it takes more strength to talk about these issues than it does to hide them. It takes more strength to uncover these issues than it does to bury them. All of you on this call have the power to change your mental health. You just have to embrace that. So today, I shared a lot with you. I shared a lot about my personal story. And one of my biggest hopes is that after this presentation, whenever you need to, whenever you're having a difficult time, you find the strength to share your story. Because you have no idea where your story will take you until you tell it. Thank you very much. Right. So I know we have questions, and I know that we have like 7 or 8 minutes. Questions on Zoom turn into like, I don't know, speed dating questions where you're just like, let me answer as many as I can. So Tracy, do you have them or do I need to?
I've got a couple of them. So one that just came through is any recommendations. One second, I gotta scroll back up. The chat is coming in very quickly. Any recommendations for best practices when addressing sexual harassment mentalities in class? Is there a way to address that will help male students feel less defensive and able to internalize consent rhetoric?
Yeah, so one thing we do in our class is like really slow walk what sexual harassment is, and we'll give kind of vague scenarios that the class can agree, disagree, or be in the middle on. So we'll start light, like somebody is liking every photo of someone on a social media platform and telling them that they look attractive. And we keep it general. We don't assign gender. We use they or other identifiers that don't assign gender, and then have the class have conversations about what that means or what is sexual harassment or what isn't sexual harassment. And through those conversations, the students define what's too far and what's not too far. And obviously you're there with like a definition and everything else, but giving them realistic kind of vague-ish scenarios allows them to say like, oh, well, if somebody asks them to stop and they won't stop, well, then that could be harassment. And they come up with all these different things. So there's really great, that's a great exercise. There's an organization called ETR, etr.org. They have a bunch of lesson plans for middle schools and high schools around this. I use the high school stuff with college students too, because it is pretty progressive. But I think that one of the most powerful ways to lessen defensiveness is bring people into the conversation and then share experiences about like what harassment feels like. I think living in LA, a lot of our students, especially our female students, are sexually harassed on the way to school. And some of them are comfortable talking about like what's going on when that happens. And so I think that's a good process.
Great. In addition to that question, there was one about, do you have any tips or recommendations for how to have some of these conversations well in a virtual environment because of COVID?
Yeah, and so what's tough in the virtual environment, like one of the things that really benefited my school was we were able to develop relationships with our students before we went into virtual. So like I can go into a virtual class, have that relationship with students and just go forward with it. For our educators who didn't have that relationship, we are starting a teacher training institute at UCLA of how to talk about mental health in a classroom. And one thing that really helps is some level of sharing your own experiences, whether it's your personal experience or what you've seen, to one, legitimize you as an educator in the room, but two, to build that trust where they're like, okay, this person knows what they're talking about. I always tell teachers, students trusting each other in a classroom is a benefit. Students trusting you as a teacher in a classroom is a must. especially when we're having these conversations. So I spend a lot of time focusing on how to build that trust with students, either by sharing personal examples or perspectives, or using other things to like really highlight a lesson, as opposed to just thinking like, oh, you should care about this, because oftentimes it's not something you just automatically care about.
Thanks so much for that, Ross. One final question is, how do you combat the fear of being put down by others if you're speaking out for mental health or against sexual assault?
Oh man, that's it's work. You know, what I have in training all the speakers that I've trained nationally, the one thing that we've always tried to prioritize is only sharing things publicly that you are comfortable and strong in knowing about yourself. As soon as we start sharing things that we haven't processed or sharing things that trigger us, it's hard to do this work, because we are going to have that fear of the repercussions for what we shared. So, my advice is, if you can do the deeper work to become comfortable, to know yourself, and to know that no matter what somebody says, you're in your truth, you're in your strength, it can help lessen that fear. And everyone has a different process with that and journey with that. My initial impetus to speak was that I was pissed off at these kids who didn't understand me. That wasn't the healthiest way to start speaking, and I had to do a lot of work to come back from that. Um, so, I think that's the strongest advice I can give.
Well, Ross, I know there were a lot of other questions, but we are at time, and I know that you have other responsibilities to take care of today. But I just wanted to thank you so much for this amazing presentation. For folks on here, this is being recorded. Once we're able to share it, it will be distributed. So please be on the lookout for it. And Ross, again, just thank you. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it, and I hope we can work together in finding more ways to get this information out there. So thanks.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you everyone for joining us today. We do have some additional sessions next week. So please check out our social media and the registration page to register for those future events. And if folks have any additional questions, feel free to send them to contact@itsonus.org, and we will make sure that they get sent to Ross, or we will try to answer them. So thanks everybody. Have a great day.